This drawing in my hands illustrates the exclusive I-beam hammer of the Geisley high-speed trigger. If you notice how it interfaces with the firing pin, it's got a very small hand or flat strike face that reaches up and hits the firing pin. It doesn't have a lot of metal at the very top of the hammer, and this is one of the design features that allows it to get its 4.4 millisecond lock time. Let's talk a little bit about all the different parts of the Geisley high-speed trigger. This here is a section view of the trigger assembly. We have the trigger, we have the hammer. This is what's known as the disconnector. This here is the safety. This screw that's underneath the tower is the sear adjustment screw. This set screw in the disconnector adjusts the second stage weight through this spring follower right here. This is the disconnector spring that's kind of chopped up here from the section view. In front is the set screw that adjusts the over travel for the trigger. This drawing illustrates how a two-stage trigger operates. Here's our trigger, here's our hammer, this is our disconnector. This structure you see right here is the trigger sear, and right here you see the hammer and hammer sear. And if you notice the overlap of the two sears or the two ledges, there's a fair amount of overlap there. That overlaps probably in the range of about a 32nd of an inch. And if you notice here that there's a gap in between the disconnector and the hammer tail. When the trigger's pulled, and in this drawing right here, the trigger has been pulled about 5 degrees. You'll notice that the tail of the hammer is now hitting the disconnector, and this is what gives you the stop point or the wall on your second stage when you come up to it. And you'll notice right here, the hammer is barely hanging on the trigger sear. That overlap right there is about 3 to 5 thousandths of an inch. You'll also notice down here on our secondary sear, which I declined to mention in the other drawing, you'll notice how they're pulled apart. That secondary sear, when the trigger's forward and has been pulled, that is an additional blocking mechanism of the trigger. So there's basically has a redundant safety mechanism. The hammer cannot go forward unless the trigger's pulled. We're going to discuss now the adjustment of the match rifle trigger. Match rifle trigger, very similar to DMR. Basically, the only differences are in the springs. It has a different trigger spring and it has a different disconnector spring. The hammer spring brings the first stage in at about 2 pounds or so. The disconnector spring allows you to get under 8 ounces on the second stage break. So with the spring combination from the factory, this trigger is probably set up at about, in the range about 2.5 pounds. If you wanted to change it for the first stage, right here is a trigger spring, and let's say you wanted to make it a little bit heavier. All you'd have to do is take a pair of pliers. In this case, this is a pair of duckbill pliers. You don't want to use needle nose pliers, just any type of a flat plier. You hold the spring right near where it exits out of the coil, and you bend down just a little bit, and you can do one leg at a time. You don't have to do 2 legs. And that right there will probably bring up your first stage weight, maybe about 0.3 of a pound or so. You can also go in the other direction and lower the first stage weight. Your limitation in lowering your first stage weight is you will get to a point where the trigger will not return. After you pull it, it will not go forward. This is all dependent upon each individual trigger, each individual weapon. Generally, that lower limit is about 1.5 pounds. You really don't want to go below that, and I really don't recommend going much below 2 pounds at all, just because as you lose lubrication, you may find yourself at a point where the trigger may not return properly and you'll have to push it forward with your finger. You really don't want to do that. So 2 pounds on the first stage is very light. And of course, you can get your second stage down to 6 ounces, which is just about a perfect trigger for bench rest or varmint shooting. We're going to discuss adjustment of the service rifle trigger here. Service rifle trigger is always meant to be above 4.5 pounds. That's the lower weight limit in CMP and NRA service rifle competition. Service rifle trigger differs from the DMR in that it has a much heavier trigger spring, but it does have the same disconnector spring. So on your second stage break, your lower limit's about 8 ounces, your upper limit 1.2, 1.3 pounds. The trigger spring is about a 4-pound pull right out of the bag. So what this means is when you set it up, you're going to be above 4.5 pounds even without adjusting anything. You can set this up with a trigger pull gauge. There's several aftermarket ones out there. We use one from Hunter Spring in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. The trouble with setting it up with a gauge rather than the actual weights that are used during a leg match is that the gauge might not correspond to the weights. There's an uncertainty of about plus or minus a half a pound with any gauge. It depends upon where the gauge hits on the trigger bow. It depends upon how far the gauge is out to clear your pistol grip or your stock. You can't really get a true and accurate reading with a gauge. You can get close, but it's not perfect. You always have to check your weight with a set of weights. I recommend that the service rifle trigger is set up no lighter than 5 pounds on a new trigger. Over the course of about 500 to 1,000 rounds, the trigger will lose about a half a pound in weight. If you set it up dead nuts on 4.5 pounds, it will go below that and you will not make weight at a leg match. It may feel perfect to you in your shop when you're first putting this in, but at your second or third leg match, it's going to be 7 o'clock in the morning and they're going to start shooting at 7:30 in the morning, and the next thing you know, your trigger doesn't pass weight and you're scrambling in order to bring the weight up. Set it up heavy, set it up at 5 pounds, let it decrease over time, and you can go back in and check it. Always check it with a set of NRA approved weights. This is how it's done. If you don't have a set, maybe one of your buddies has a set, make sure that this little centering device that hits the trigger bow is always in the same spot that it's supposed to be. Make sure that you're always in the center of the bow. When you pick it up, you notice it hangs freely, and just a little jerk down sets it off. That's a perfect service rifle trigger right there. You'll always make weight with that trigger. Let me just show you how to lubricate this. Here's our Guy's oil, as we call it. 1 drop on top of the disconnector. 1 drop on each side of the trigger spring. On each side, let it run down the receiver. Here's our grease for the sear. You can use oil on the sear if you want. We recommend this type of grease. It'll last a long time. Just put a dab here on the inside, dab on the outside of the tail, a little bit on the face of the disconnector here, and a little bit under the trigger. That's all you need. Every once in a while, just add more grease. You don't have to clean it off. Just a little bit more. That'll last thousands of rounds. Thanks for listening today. I appreciate your time. Take care.